This meeting is being recorded.
Wow. All right. Happy Monday, everybody, and welcome to this month's Wine and Culture Chat. Super excited about this one because we have a special guest, Miss Simi Grewal. Am I saying that right?
Grewal, yeah.
Grewal?
Pretty good.
You know, I'll be jacking people's names up. I got a little accent. She's joining us from Decant SF, which is San Fran, right? Or was that San for something else? I'm making it up as I go along. She's a wine shop owner. She's a certified somm, and we're just going to get into her journey. If you don't know what the Wine and Culture Chats are, they're really just very honest conversations between the wine community. And so I've always find them very interesting because you get to see and meet people and learn about their journey and how they got to the place where they are, but also like what do those challenges look like? How do we overcome them? And you also get some really good business tips from Simi because she's running a very successful wine shop. So if you're interested in leveraging any of those things in the sense of you want to open a wine shop, you want to know what it's like being an entrepreneur, you want to know what it's like dating as an entrepreneur, which is an interesting
I don't know
topic.
how we have to contribute on that last part, but
I know it's bizarre, but this is where we are. So thank you, Simi, for joining me. I know you're wildly busy.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to really just like connect with everybody and be able to have this opportunity. It's really exciting, honestly.
Yeah, I hope that you guys will go and visit Simi. She's we'll get to the address and stuff at the end, but let's just jump right into it. So let's talk about your childhood. Obviously you are a first, let me not say obviously, because that might not be obvious to everybody. I know that because I had a conversation with you. To be fair, you are a first generation Indian American. You come from a pretty traditional family just from our conversations, but what does that look like? Like when we say that, what is it to be a first generation immigrant? Is it okay if I say that?
Yeah, I mean, well, the child of immigrants, certainly.
Yeah.
It's, you know, I come from a household where my parents came here, you know, they came to the US to work as doctors, which I think a lot of Indian Americans in my generation had that exact same experience, because really when Indians were being led into the country, a lot of it came through sort of genius visas. And then the other side of it was really the working class. And so, you know, my parents both came here actually in 1980 and they did their residencies in the Bronx. So, you know, just like many immigrants to this country at that time, really like started with nothing and kind of worked their way up because of their education. And so, you know, came up in a household which obviously education was the most important thing, but also in a household where it kind of was like, oh, either you're going to go into law or you're going to go into medicine, and because there are no professions that exist outside of that. And so that when we talk about tradition, like certainly like traditional in the sense from that standpoint, you know, our parents came here with a very specific task at hand, and that was to be successful. And I think, you know, certainly amongst Indian Americans, that success was defined by money and is certainly still defined by money. And secondly, like get an education and go into a career that is very quote unquote respectable. So certainly my experience was a little bit outside the box and still is outside the box for sure.
How do they cope with that? Like when you was like, you know what, I'm actually not going to be a doctor and I'm not interested in law. First of all, when did you discover that? Because it's hard to go against your parents, particularly like when you have like a community that's very much built on those aesthetics. How did you break that to them?
I think it was sort of like a slow burn, if you will, in the sense that for me, when I was a teenager, I definitely came up in the Food Network generation where like I was watching a lot of these shows on TV in the background and slowly like didn't even realize that I was super interested in food. I just knew, I really enjoyed cooking. I would see things on TV and I'd be like, let me try it out at home. And slowly, just throughout high school, I developed this real love of cooking in general. But of course, still being on that path of got to go to a good college, going to get into college, going to, follow the standard, this is what you do, 1, 2, 3, and you get a good, nice job somewhere with a good corporation, good benefits. And I think when I got into my first year of college and I was kind of figuring out what I wanted to major in, I said, well, what do I really enjoy the most? I think it was one of my counselors, honestly, at that time, and said, well, what do you enjoy the most? And I kind of sat there and said, honestly, I love cooking. Like, I really love food. And so I started to very, very quietly explore this idea of transferring to culinary school. And when I floated it to my parents halfway through my freshman year of college, I think my mom looked at me like I had 4 heads, and my dad just kind of like didn't even respond because he thought it was such a joke. And, and when I kind of just kept saying it over and over, that, and to the point where I was attending informational seminars for like, prospective students, then there was this sort of panic that set in of, well, you can't do that. And so the very serious conversation came up of, look, cooking is a thing that maybe you want to do, but the deal is with us, you have to finish your 4 years of undergrad with a bachelor's in something that is not culinary. And so they were like, after you do that, you can figure out what you want to do, but like this is a mandate. You have to finish 4 years of college, and you're either going to do economics or business or something that is just traditional so that it can get you out onto the right path. And so, I listened to that. At that point, certainly, I think, again, a lot of Indian Americans in my situation, your parents are really dictating to you, and there's a level of not wanting to disappoint them because you see how hard that they've worked to get you to where you are. So I said, all right, fine. But also I'm a little bit sneaky, and I'm a little bit, I'm very, very strong-headed. And so I was really fortunate that I was going to school at NYU. And NYU has this fantastic program within it called Gallatin, the School of Individualized Study, where if you can essentially justify kind of, why a degree makes sense for you to study and what you might do with it, the school will let you create your own curriculum. And so for me, the more I got into food studies, the more I was getting kind of observing hospitality from afar and observing really at that time global food systems from the government standpoint. How does grain get from point A to point B? How are local economies built around food and harvest? That was something that was really interesting to me from the geopolitical standpoint. I said, well, why don't I kind of study that stuff? So that inherently involved economics. So basically my core degree was kind of in economics with a minor in business. I did a minor in food studies, did a little nutrition, and then did all of my internships and all my summer jobs revolved around hospitality. And kind of just took on, I said, well, let me do everything I can do. And I called the degree The Business of Food. Because ultimately, food is a business, whether, no matter what you're doing, whether it's hospitality or your supply chains, whatever it is, getting from point A to point B, from the producer to the consumer, it's all a business. And you need to understand how it works in order to operate within that space. So for me, I didn't necessarily know during my 4 years that I would end up in hospitality, but I said, let me just kind of study all of it and see what clicks.
So then how did that go? I have 2 questions with that. There is obviously a level of guilt in there, right? And you mentioned culturally, there's a lot of, and I have other Indian friends who are also first generation, and they kind of went a different path too, and is very traumatizing for them, the reaction of their parents, and the disappointment that they felt like they were contributing towards not only their immediate family, but it was almost like they were embarrassing their parents, and there was this level of you have to do this because you're carrying on the legacy. It was kind of your happiness or your thought processes came secondary to the embarrassment. Did you feel like that at all? And like, how did you get past the idea of disappointing them? I mean, I see how you maneuvered, which was very slick, very slick.
I think, the biggest thing for me was just prove them wrong. Like that my whole life. So I'm one of 3 kids. I'm the middle child. And most importantly, I'm the only girl. So my whole life growing up, I would look at my older brother, my younger brother, and they were allowed to do a lot of things that I was not allowed to do. I wasn't allowed to sleep over at friends' houses. If I wanted to go to a friend's house, I had to get permission. If I had a friend having a sweet 16, it was always an argument with my dad of, whether or not I should be at a party. He definitely, now he's a lot softer in his old age, but when I was growing up, he was very, very protective because he grew up in a family where, he was the youngest of 8 kids and he was the only boy. And so there was a lot of responsibility on his shoulders in that traditional way of what is the role of a boy? What is the role of a girl? And, while at the same time, he's like, look, you have to go out and create an independent life for yourself. He also was very limiting in telling me what I could and could not do. And the constant excuse when I would say, well, why does my brother get to do this and I don't? And literally the response was, because you're a girl. And to me, it just kind of created fire in my belly. And it made me really angry, to be quite honest. Like I was always fighting because I said, this is ridiculous. And, certainly I come from, I feel like with Indian women in particular, the culture that I've grown up around, it's very much like, well, just don't rock the boat. I would kind of, stomp my feet and say, well, this is unfair. This is crazy. Like, I get better grades or I work harder or I'm more responsible, but ultimately responsible, you're a girl. And my mom would say, don't waste your energy on getting upset about these things, because in the end, you'll still be able to do what you want. You just got to get 18 years in this household. And to me, it wasn't about, well, I just got to get through the 18 years. It said, well, on principle, this is unfair. And if you're telling me that I can get the grades and do the things that are right, I should be afforded all the same, liberties that my brothers have. And so I always kind of was fighting. And so when my parents said, look, you can't go to culinary school, again, it was just another battle for me to say, okay, well, how do I work around it? And one thing I've learned my whole life is, look, you can go against what people say, but if you're going to do it, you got to be the best at what you're doing. And so I always pursued a level of excellence was kind of my goal. I said, okay, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it right. I'm going to get all the experience so that when somebody tries to make an argument against why I can't do something, I have the defense. I have the bullet points to say, well, I did A, B, C. And I think that, it's obviously not a great way to grow up being told you constantly can't do things. But I think I was also like luckily born with this mentality of, okay, tell me I can't do it. I'll
Rebellion. Do it. You're naturally rebellious. You're definitely a lot more fiery than like I said, my other friends, and that's not necessarily a comparison, but it's definitely striking, right? Because you're very much like, oh, all right, so I'll see you at the other side of this. I'm
also from New York, so that's.
So how did you get from culinary into wine? I mean, obviously it's an easy transition, but you ended up, having an incredible wine career. And what does that look like? Because you had some really great wine jobs.
Yeah, I think, again, going back to this idea of, okay, well, how do you kind of deal with the guilt that you bring to your parents? And the guilt factor is, okay, I'm going to do something they don't like, but I'll do it in the best way possible. And very early on in my career in restaurants, I think I was 20 when I had my first management job. I was fresh out of college. I was managing a restaurant in the West Village in Manhattan. And it was, a very neighborhood restaurant. It was poorly run, but I showed up and they gave me a job. And the first thing I learned was, oh, the money is made in beverage. That's where you make your margin in a restaurant. You don't make it on food, you make it on alcohol. And so I really quickly learned, okay, well, that's a side of the business that I need to learn more about. And obviously at 20 years old, it was very limited how I could learn, but I soon turned 21, and the restaurant I was at said, "Hey, okay, we're going to put you in charge of wine buying." I didn't know anything about wine, but this place was so poorly run that, the management team was so lazy that they're like, "Oh, here's this kid. She's enthusiastic. She'll do it." And so I, quickly started talking to wine buyers and I'm sorry, to wine salespeople. And I said, okay, this is kind of cool because all of these things I'm tasting have a story. And so I don't know, I just kind of got this bug where I was like, this is interesting. I don't know much about it. And I didn't know how to learn about it. So I just got on the internet and I'm kind of trying to find ways, what are courses I could take, classes. Um, and I really quickly, at that time, the Culinary Institute of America had launched a new program in Napa at the Greystone campus that was specifically it was a post-bachelor's program, 1-year certificate program focused only on wine studies.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea being that, look, if you're already working in the restaurant industry, this is a great way for you to sort of fast track into wine and beverage. Because I think at that time, this was in 2010, 2011, beverages were kind of growing at a renewed rate. People were getting more interested in wine and cocktails, and there was a need for it. And I think the Culinary Institute kind of recognized, like, well, we do culinary, but we don't do the beverage side super well, but there's a need for that. And so they created this program. And I said, well, why not? I'm still in this phase where I'm trying to figure out what I wanted to do. At that time, I was still going back and forth between working in restaurants and thinking about going into sort of food justice. I was really interested in working with NGOs in foreign countries about food security. That was part of the degree that I studied. And so, this was also 2010, not long after the recession had hit, and those jobs they weren't there. NGOs were not hiring. Traveling abroad was, sure, you can come work for us, but we're not going to pay you anything. And that wasn't feasible. So beverages kind of happened as a happy accident, which I think that's most people's entrance into beverage, especially into wine. It's sort of, you end up there not necessarily because you intended to, but once you get there, you realize, oh, this is where I'm supposed to be.
Yeah, right. I think actually we started our career around the same time, around 2010, getting our jobs. And I mean, my story is no secret, like, where I was treated. I started my career at the St. Regis. You also worked in luxury spaces. Yeah. And, we could trade stories for days on the sexism, the racism, the microaggressions, and all of those things. And I think one of the biggest lessons for me coming out of that space was like where I am now, like to hold my own, because I don't know if this was true for you, but for at that time, you just lose so much of yourself trying to prove that you belong in the space, and they take so much from you because you have to look a certain way, you have to talk a certain way, you have to, behave a certain way. And so a lot of your identity gets stripped. And I think the biggest lesson coming out of that for me was like that no one will ever strip me of myself, my authenticity of who I am again. What was that like for you? Like, what did you feel like coming out of, can you tell everybody where you worked? Because you had a couple different jobs in New York, and what those lessons were like coming through the adversity of being, I'm sure the microaggressions were a little different from mine, but probably similar. So you could talk about that as well if you want. If it's traumatizing, definitely don't have to go there. But let's talk about those experiences though.
Yeah, so it's no secret on my resume. When I graduated from the CIA, I went back to New York and I got hired at 11 Madison Park, which at that time, I think when I started there, they were in the top 20, and the year I got in, I think they quickly got to number 10 on the list, and then by the time I left, they were number 5. And so every person on that staff, that's a grind. It's a 3 Michelin star restaurant in New York City. It was kind of the height of this movement of ranking restaurants. And I went there saying, off the bat, I was like, I had just passed my certified sommelier. I was very focused on how do I build my career. And I went there, everybody there starts at the bottom as a kitchen server. I had never really worked in like a properly functioning restaurant where there's a very strict hierarchy where everyone has a very specific role and it moves like a really fine-tuned clock. And it was a lot. I kind of liked it because I really thrive in a very structured environment. But at the same time, when I got there, I was the only Indian person on staff. It was kind of like, well, what are you doing here? Did you fail out of medical school? There was a lot of that kind of, those digs that were really sort of, nobody means any harm by it, but it is definitely reinforcing a narrative just amongst your peers. And my whole life, I mean, honestly, up until I opened my own business, those kind of digs, I just kind of laughed them off because I don't even think, you don't register that it is a microaggression when someone's trying to label you on something. But now when I look back, I'm like, oh yeah, that did bother me in a way, kind of having to constantly shrug off comments. But in those environments where you're working 18 hours a day with the same crew, everyone's exhausted, everyone's, overworked, underpaid, but we're all working towards a mission. You justify this horrible environment because you're on a mission we got to get to number one in the world. It becomes everything just becomes a blur and you accept it. But certainly I think, being Indian American in that time in like very high-end dining, I was a little bit of an oddity. And I think anomaly, yeah. And people noticed it and people made comments about it and people kind of were like, well, what are you doing here? And, your parents definitely are disappointed in you. And I think, even at that time, my dad was super upset with me. I mean, for years he was angry with me. I know you have a child. Hopefully you don't pass on any pressure, but it was definitely a hard time to just kind of be like, put your nose down, just work hard, and hopefully something comes of it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to this day, like my dad is the kind of guy, and I've made peace with it, who's never going to be okay with any of it. I think he was talking to my aunt recently, and he said, "Oh yeah, that time that Simi was working at 7-Eleven." And she was like, "Do you mean 11 Madison Park?" Like he's so far removed from understanding restaurants that to him it's like, it's all the same. But
I don't mean to laugh, but gee whiz, 7-Eleven and yeah,
that's
a far reach. But
going back to right. Yeah, but going back to your question, I don't think I ever realized or recognized people putting me down or people, being aggressive towards me until I was out of it on my own. Because I think when you stand on your own 2 feet, you can really start to say, well, what's my identity? And certainly through the whole time I was working the last 10 years, it wasn't about let people see my identity. It was more so just fit in so that you can keep moving. And I think so many of us work on that plane because especially in fine dining doesn't care about your identity. Fine dining, and I get that. Part of the experience is that the guests should just feel like they are transported. You're paying a lot of money to just feel like you're transported away. And so, what your server looks like or what your sommelier looks like should not really, you don't want that to impact your meal. You just want the plate in front of you and the glass in front of you to speak. And that's the only thing that should impact your experience. But in reality, what makes a restaurant work are the people who are there and the culture that is built amongst the staff. And so if you have a strong culture and a strong camaraderie, it's going to make the experience of hospitality that much better, in my opinion.
Did you ever feel, because fine dining is what it is, like it's a huge gatekeeping society, did you ever feel unprotected, right? Like, to your point of the guest spending a certain amount of money and having an expectation of their experience, it's usually the guest that is creating these toxic experiences for the server or the som because they look different or something like that. And did you ever feel that they were protecting you, or you felt unprotected, or it never really occurred that way?
I never felt necessarily unprotected. I think my personal experience is I certainly had a lot of instances over the course of my career where I felt very uncomfortable about comments that were made towards me. And in a few instances, yes, like physical, physical things that have happened. But I've been really, really fortunate that I've pretty much always worked with teams that everyone is an upstanding professional. And, I remember early on in my career, I was serving a table, and this was here in California, where I worked at another Michelin star restaurant, and we catered to an exceptionally high-end clientele, but in an environment where it was a little bit more casual. And the couple of times where I was made to feel uncomfortable, the management teams I worked with were really quick to just step in and say, "We believe what you said," and remove a guest. And that is so important. I mean, but again, those were like physical altercations where something happened, I was touched inappropriately, and as a woman, I felt protected. Well, when it comes to your race and your ethnicity, it's a different story, because it's your individual experience, and so it's hard to hold people accountable, when they say things to you rather than when they do things to you. And certainly I've had a ton of experiences, especially with a high-end clientele, where they're not sensitive, and they don't know that what they're saying is offensive or incorrect. And, again, in hospitality, the number one job that we have is to make people feel comfortable and make them feel happy. And so it's always this kind of, weighing out your options of, well, did they mean something by it or did they not? And I think that's where the trickiness comes in our industry. Is hospitality at its core. You have to do whatever you can to make your guest have a really, really great time. And sometimes that comes at the cost of your own feelings, for better or worse. But owning your own space becomes different, because you can tell people, like, hey, get out of here. Like, I'm not making you sit down for a $300 tasting menu. You're here in my bar, and I'm going to do the best I can, but I don't need to do that at the expense of my feelings. And so I think that's important.
So let's talk about that. That was a good transition. So how did you get from New York to San Fran, and did you move directly to San Fran to open the wine bar, or were there jobs in between there?
Yeah, so I left New York. I left New York after a year of working in super fine dining, and a lot of it was because it was just an exceptionally toxic environment. And while I said, okay, look, a 3-star is not really what I want to be doing, I did really like that structure of being in a high-end restaurant. And I also felt that there was a lot to learn from the wine standpoint. If you want to learn about wine, working in these high-end establishments is the only way you're going to taste, some of these really unique bottles. And so I don't have any regrets about that. In fact, I often miss working with a thick wine list where, you want to taste it, you better sell it. That's such an important thing that I feel like a lot of younger sommeliers these days don't recognize. I think a lot of people are really quick to be like, oh, those big grand award lists, it's so hoity-toity, whatever it might be. I said, yeah, but where else are you going to be able to taste Bordeaux from the 80s on a regular basis? And where else are you going to like sharpen those wine skills? So when I left New York, it very much was, I'm going to California, because I had heard San Francisco, first of all, had much better weather than New York. And secondly, I heard the sommelier community was just really welcoming. In New York, I found it to be really competitive. Like, even getting into a tasting group was really difficult, which at that time seemed kind of silly to me. Whereas when I came out here, like half a dozen tasting groups immediately said, hey, you need a place to be. Why don't you come join us? So I like the community that's out here. And I think, if you're studying, you need to find a good community. You need to find people who are going to support you. So when I came out here, I applied to a ton of jobs. I ended up taking a job at this fantastic restaurant called the Village Pub, which is in Woodside in Silicon Valley. And I got hired as a junior sommelier, eventually moved up to a full-time sommelier, and I was there for about 4 years. And what was great about that job is that every year you traveled, you were sent somewhere on a wine trip, which is huge. Travel is such an important part of becoming a sommelier. Like, you really need to understand cultures around the world, understand the foods that they eat, the way that they consume wine, because wine is contextual. You can't just like drink a glass here, sitting here in the States and not know anything about the place that it came from, because you won't understand why the wine was made.
Right.
And again, going back to that storytelling. So yeah, so I did that work, and after a while, I was lucky that the company I was working for it really pushed us to, if you worked in the wine department, you had to understand all the costs and finances, which again is like, not enough people understand that being a sommelier is more than drinking wine and pouring wine. It's really like, well, how do I justify running a wine program? How do I make my costs work?
Right.
It's a skill you need to know. So I learned quite a bit of that with this particular job. And so when the opportunity came up to open Decant, it came because my business partner, Cara, who actually I graduated from the CIA with, she came to me and she said, look, I have this idea of bringing hospitality, Michelin style hospitality, to a retail forum. Because we were finding that, when we as young, women in our 20s shopping at local retail stores, we were getting the shaft. Like, people didn't want to give us the time of day. They were selling us kind of junk wine. You'd go in and say, hey, I'm studying for an exam. I need a bottle of A, B, or C. And, they just weren't treating us very well. And we said, well, if this is how we're getting treated as sommeliers in a really small town where a lot of people do know who we are, how is the average woman walking into a wine store and getting treated? What are they getting sold? Do they understand what they're drinking? And so everything we did with Decant San Francisco was born out of this idea of how do we serve a community that has really just kind of been, while they produce the most dollars for the wine industry, women, they're kind of just not marketed to in a proper way. And so that was a lot of what the genesis of Decant San Francisco was. So we started talking about this idea in 2016, and we were eventually able to open Decant in 2019. It took about 3 years of, finding a space, of fundraising money. But eventually when we opened it, we said, look, we're going to do this in a way that we want to be able to serve everybody. We want to meet people where they're at. So if you walk in and you're like, hey, I have $20 and I want to drink a really good bottle of wine, and this is what I'm cooking tonight, we can help you. Or if you say, hey, I have a friend's 50th birthday and I want to throw down, what do I get? We can do it all. That's where we started from. And so that's, the shop and the bar. It's a shop and a bar, and we try to be everything, which is challenging, but we try to be everything because we didn't have that. Yeah. And it's important.
I think, as you mentioned, as toxic as luxury fine dining can be, for sure, it definitely gives you a skill set that you're able to translate into a lot of other things. And I do 100% appreciate it for that, right? It teaches you how to be bespoke. It teaches you how to cater to your guests and to how to be in service. I do think that, not for nothing, it serves a purpose in that way. But what is it like running a wine shop? I mean, / bar, because it's both. What is that like? Like, what does your day-to-day look like?
Ooh. It's hard. It's really hard. We opened before the pandemic, and we opened, the space, when you walk in, it looks like a shop, but then we also have this big bar space. And where we opened in San Francisco was kind of smack between the headquarters of Twitter and Airbnb and Pinterest. And so we had a great happy hour crowd. And then at the same time, like, we were building a nice little retail community for the neighbors who lived in those few blocks. And then obviously the pandemic changed it all.
Yeah.
And it's become, now it's, we built an online store. We got very, very much involved with shipping things, creating several different wine clubs. We do a lot of classes. But the pandemic really forced us, again, this idea of be everything, serve everyone. That is because you have to create revenue. And running a business is really, really, really hard. And I have to say, like, it's not something that would be possible to do on my own. There's no way that Decant would be what it is if there were not two of us, because we divide our responsibilities.
Yeah.
I think it's really important, if you're thinking about getting into your own business, that you look at physically what you're capable of. everyone says, oh, you're going to be working nonstop. And it's like, yeah, you know that. But when you're doing it, it becomes, I mean, you know this, Tahira, like it's nuts. It's absolutely nuts.
You have to force yourself to stop. Like it's nonstop. There's no vacation days. Like vacations are split between work in the morning and vacation at night, or however, but it's not stop. Yeah.
Yeah. And you have to kind of like force yourself, that whole idea of self-care. I think, a few years ago, it's like, self-care, like whatever, like you have days off. But when you own a business, you don't have any days off because your constant worry is your business. And your nightmares and your dreams are invaded by, did we run out of food to sell, or are we going to be able to pay the rent this month? It's like all of these little things in the daytime, you can't turn them off, because when it becomes your responsibility, it kind of just becomes ingrained in your DNA. So there's a lot of people, especially in San Francisco, because this is a very specific industry town. People come up to me, even just last weekend, it was a big festival weekend in San Francisco, and there were a number of people who walked up to me and said, oh, you have the best job in the world. Like, I'm thinking of opening a wine bar too, or I want to open a wine shop. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. Like, what do you do now? Oh, I'm in marketing and tech. And the first thing I tell people is like, yeah, it's a really nice gig, but you know what's nice about marketing and tech is like, you can afford to drink all these wines all the time. You don't have to work to taste them. And that's I think you have to really remember, it's to some extent, yeah, what we do is awesome. Like, I'm really excited to be able to have the food experiences and the wine experiences that I do and be a part of this industry. But like, you work so hard, and you don't get the benefits because naturally in our industry, the restaurant industry, people are like, the staff is the last thing on an operator's mind very frequently. I'm glad that tide is changing. I am genuinely, even for us, like we try to do nice things for our staff. We're a super small business. We don't have any margin, but like, we don't just start at minimum wage, which a lot of places will do, because we understand minimum wage is not a livable wage. But you have to understand, if you want to work in this industry, that like, number one is the bottom line, and the bottom line means selling product. And unfortunately, in a lot of places in that industry, it comes at the cost of, workers' comfort or putting people first. So you have to really find the right job if you want to get into this. I know a lot of people on these talks are not necessarily in the wine industry. So I always like to tell people that the honest truth, right? You got to be real with people. Like, this is a great industry, but working it as a career is so hard.
It is. It's very difficult. And it also terrifying when you're responsible for other people's livelihood. And I think that people don't realize that, like, I worked by myself for up until last year. That was when I started hiring people, and it's terrifying. Like, when you are responsible for people eating and living, and they're like, it's like, oh my God. And so that when you're talking about like sleeping, you're like, oh my God, did I do this? Like, are these things going to run right? Am I going to be able to pay these people this month? Like, what did this happen? Like, it's terrifying. Entrepreneurship, when they say it's not for the faint of heart, they're not talking about like, it's a lot of mental.
You have to have that mental fortitude. For
It's
sure.
a lot of mental Olympics.
You have to find your happy places. Like for me, I like getting outside. Honestly, during the pandemic, I have golfed my whole life. I've never golfed very well, but I grew up in the Tiger Woods era. My parents were convinced that like, if they started us off, we were going to go to college on golf scholarships, which was the most ridiculous thing in the world. Definitely that did not pan out. However, during the pandemic, I was like, well, the only thing that are open are golf courses. And I had a couple of girlfriends who were like, yeah, we all have like old golf clubs that somebody left in a garage. Like, let's just try it out. And that really quickly became the only like source of escape that I had. And it was a really good way for me to learn how to draw a boundary, where I would tell my business partner, like, hey, look, I'm going to be golfing on Monday, this 4-hour window, I'm not going to respond to you. And all of us, the ladies I was golfing with, we're all in the wine industry. Like, we were all working restaurants. And for us, we were like, this is our time. And so having some sort of practice, no matter what it is, it could be pottery, it could be gardening, like whatever it is, like you have to find something that keeps you sane. because if you don't carve that time out, like, it's just, you hear voices.
No, well, legitimately, your voice, and it's always your own voice in your head. It's just like all of these things. It's insane. This is a surreal experience that unless you're an entrepreneur, it's hard to even explain. Like, it seems like there's so much freedom, but you could definitely become like a captive to your own thoughts in your head on a regular basis if you're not cognizant of like being intentional. Like, yo, I have to shut this off because this is getting out of control. I think my daughter does a good job of balancing that. Like, she's very, very clear on her boundaries. She's just like, no, you said we were going to do, because I'm always like, okay, just give me 10 more minutes. Let me finish this. Or I gotta do this. I gotta take this call. I gotta do this meeting. And she'd be like, no, you said we were doing this, that, and the other. And I'm like, you're right. And I'm never gonna make her feel like my work is more important than she is. And so I have a built-in kind of system for me. But what else? Like, what about like dating? Because I find it extremely difficult to date, right? I'm a mom and I have a business, which is also like having two kids, obviously. And it's just like your time is so precious. It's like, how do you?
Yeah, that's a whole nother, I think part of having a business is really like you make a lot of sacrifices. And especially in the, when we opened up this business, we knew like, oh yeah, it'll be really hard. And everyone says like 3 years is going to be sort of your breaking point to when you can finally find a comfort and balance because you can hire staff and all this stuff. And then obviously for us, like with the pandemic, we still feel like we're in year one in a lot of ways because we don't have any of this data. And so again, forcing yourself to make space for things is really important, but it's also really difficult because you feel guilty. At least me, I should say, I feel guilty when I say, okay, I'm going to take time away to do something because any minute I'm not working, it means like, oh, I'm sacrificing money in a way. Like if you're not building revenue for the business, you're dying. And so taking time away is really hard to justify, especially when it's for, an online date that, 9 times out of 10 is not going to lead anywhere.
Right.
And,
Right.
when we first opened, it was like we were trying to make space for those things. I think both myself and my business partner were like, yeah, we have to do this. And it's like, you do it. And you're like, well, that was a waste of 2 hours of my life.
Yes. Like, do you know what I could have been doing?
Yeah, because your biggest, most valuable thing in your life when you become a business owner is time. It's hours in the day. And so I will say this, dating has been a real like this is not a great situation for me since opening a business because the few times I've tried it, I sit there with the guilt of, well, this is not a great date, and now I'm like sitting here with my mind thinking about work, but looking at this person and trying to be like, yeah, that's so interesting, but it's not. So
Yeah.
I think I have realized like creating different spaces and different ways of engaging with people on that level is like a more effective use of my time rather than like the online dating thing. But again, this all leads back to how many hours a week are you going to give yourself? And I allot, I'm a very my friends are really, really important to me. Like for me, every week, if I have a day off, like I allocate that time to the people I love most in my life because they are the people who bring me the most joy. And so whether it's dating or it's not dating, it's like, all right, I give myself, 2 nights a week where whether it's after work or in the evening, like even tonight after this call, Monday's my day off, right? Day off. Spent the day at trade tastings today, running around town because that's the day that every Monday is the day everybody does their portfolio tastings. I came home, I took like a 30-minute nap, and then I jumped on this call. And then tonight is this is my night off. I'm gonna go see a friend who's in town. Yeah. But I don't know. To me, I think dating has become one of those ideas of like, I don't want to have to work. Dating can feel like a job these days, in my personal opinion, and I don't want to have to work at yet another thing. So I kind of let it happen naturally when it happens. But it's hard. I mean, you have to make these decisions. And I also think when you're an entrepreneur who owns a business, if you're dating someone who doesn't own a business,
No,
they don't
don't get
understand.
it. They don't get it.
Like
They don't get
it's
it.
just you have to, like, people don't understand your madness and
No.
your willingness to overwork all the time.
Yeah.
So finding a workaholic is also an important thing because it's like, great, we see each other,
I give
we
you
can
your
work off
space, you give me my space, and we
we see
find
each
that
other
joy
once in a
in
while
all
when
the
it's
times.
necessary.
So I think my last question is, what advice would you give somebody who was trying to open a wine shop?
Oh man, well, first find a business partner because it's going to be harder than you think. And that's really, like, if you have big lofty dreams like we did with Decant to like service as many people as possible and meet them where they're at, that means you have to be constantly thinking of ideas and executing ideas and making time and space, and that can be really difficult. So I think first and foremost, like, having a good partner alongside you who you trust and who has a skill set different from yours, is important.
That's key.
um, Secondly, I think really having a firm understanding of economics in the sense of, like, can you read a profit and loss statement? Do you understand what cash flow is? Those kinds of simple things, like the basic accounting 101, as simple as it sounds, like, it's really important. Because a lot of people, again, like, people will come up to me, oh, I want to open a shop. And I was like, great, like, how much are you going to fundraise? Or how much inventory do you want to carry? How much rent are you willing to pay? People don't think about those questions. And, like, the number one thing you have to understand is, all right, great, if you're going to pay, $5,000 a month in rent, how much money do you have to make every month to do that and pay yourself? Um, and the last most important bit of advice is coming to pay yourself. Like, I think a lot of people, you don't realize it, but until you start talking to people around the country who do own wine shops, a lot of them are independently wealthy. And so it does make it look really easy when you look at someone and you're like, oh yeah, well, they're doing great. They're making money. Like, they have a nice, comfortable life. A lot of the times it's not what it seems. Like, once you start talking to people a little bit more deeply, you realize, oh, this person has another source of income. And I think, we had to really, we still struggle with this of, like, paying ourselves an appropriate amount. We definitely, Cara and I both took massive pay cuts from our cushier wine jobs when we decided to open this. And we did not think that, almost 4 years on, we'd still be paying ourselves a very basic salary, but that's what the pandemic has done. And while, when you opened up this conversation, you're saying, oh, very successful wine shop. And that means a lot to me. And I appreciate it because I feel like people do see us and they're like, oh yeah, you guys are doing a great job. But you have to rework how you define success.
Yeah.
If you're getting into this industry to make money, that's not what it's about.
Yeah.
If you're getting into this industry because you want to meet really incredible people and you want to travel and, like, experience different cultures from around the world, then yeah, this is the place to be. But don't ever think that you're going to make a ton of money and, retire early and all this stuff. Like, people in this industry are passionate. I'm passionate. I love what I do, but I'm not sitting here, like, thinking, oh, I got a bunch of cash to burn at the end of the month. So knowing that you're going to make a lot of sacrifices along the way is a big one.
So what brings you joy? Like, what is your proudest moment so far in the trajectory of your career?
I think my proudest moment is definitely right now operating Decant. Of, like, every day somebody will come in and be like, you've changed the way I consume wine, or you changed the way I understand, like, how I eat a meal. Because for me, it all comes back to, like, the table, right? The dining table is such an important place in every culture. There's no culture across the world that doesn't come together over a meal. Like, meals are the form of celebration that everyone all across the planet can understand. And that's where I started in my joy of this industry, and it's still where I sit today. My absolute favorite time of year is Thanksgiving and Christmas. Like, I don't celebrate Christmas in a traditional sense, but it's a great excuse for my friends and I to get together and cook a huge meal and open up some really special bottles. And just that feeling is incredible. But my joy comes again from hospitality. When people say like, oh, you gave me this really special experience, and it's a memory that sits with them and makes an impact on how they consume things now going forward. Like, it's a small victory, but it's an impactful one. And I think if you can convey like joy and happiness through food and wine, then that's, for me, what makes me happiest.
That's beautiful. Well, thank you, Simi. I want to open it up in case anybody has a few questions before we let Simi go enjoy the rest of her night off. You can absolutely just unmute yourself and ask anything if you have a question or comment.
Glad I inspired so many questions.
Yeah, hi, this is Steph. I have a quick question for you. You mentioned that if you want to open a retail shop, which I do, and I've been doing a lot of research. I'm in South Jersey, right near Philly. So I know like for a lot of the folks on the phone, they know about Happy Cork, which is in Brooklyn. So kind of giving that type of feel in the Philly, South Jersey area. But I was going into it in a mindset, I want to do it on my own. But listening to you, you're like, make sure you think about this and go into it with a partner, but make sure you're balancing each other. So what are you bringing to the table versus your partner? Because that's where I'm struggling. Like, I'm thinking we have to have the same skill sets. Like, I have a business background and now I'm in this industry. So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I should preface that by saying, the partner is important if you want to really tackle everything. And Cara, so my business partner, we both are sommeliers by training, but my strength and my background is really the administrative stuff, looking at numbers, balancing the budget, honestly, all the boring stuff like getting the taxes done and paying, accounts, all of that kind of stuff is really my purview. I manage the staff, I do the onboarding. Whereas Cara is very forward on social media. That's what she balances, creating products and ideas for us to be able to market. We do a lot. I will say, like, we do more than most wine shops and wine bars, at least in our immediate area, because we have found that programming is really important. And by programming, I mean holding events, things to promote. But if you're both people who can balance a budget, but neither one of you is like an ideas person to say, okay, how are we gonna drive revenue next month, or what are some things that we can bring in? You might run a really efficient business, but is it necessarily going to be capturing all the revenue that you might want to capture? So in that sense, that's why I say having a partner is important. Also, for the idea of, are you going to want to take time off in the next 3 years or 4 years or 10 years? And if you take time off, who's going to be there to help you? Because finding staff these days is impossible. No matter where you are, anywhere in the country, everybody I talk to, you cannot find reliable staff who is willing to work, Saturdays or Sundays or evenings. So that's why a partnership is really important, because physically, I will say, like, how are you okay with being inside the four walls of your store 90 hours a week? You have to think about how many hours do you want to be operating and open to the public, and how many hours are you willing to be there on a realistic level? And so if you're not willing to say, I'm willing to be there 100% of the hours, and then even more so, because again, you might be open to the public 40 hours a week, but you physically might have to be there for 70 hours a week to make it all work. Those are questions you really have to ask yourself, because it's hard work. And I think having a partner, if I didn't have a partner, I don't know if I would have gotten this far, like if the business would still be standing, because we give each other space to take time away. And that's really important for your sanity.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Good luck. I hope to hear about whatever you have coming up soon.
Does anybody else have a question?
This is awesome information. I appreciate all of it.
Of course.
I have a quick question. I'm just curious, was San Francisco a strategic choice? And if so, why, based on what?
Definitely not a strategic choice. I again, like I said, I moved up to Napa to go to the CIA, and so outside of New York, California was the only place I had ever lived, and so I ended up here. And then when I decided I was unhappy working in restaurants in New York, I didn't really know where else to go. But because I had graduated from the CIA, I had some sort of familiarity with San Francisco. So I decided, try it out. I think for me, I'm from, being from New York is also one of the most expensive cities in the US. So moving to another super expensive city was like not completely out of the question. But in the sense that I do firmly believe San Francisco is one of the most exciting wine cities in the world. And I also believe that the community here is amazing. Like if you want to grow your career, San Francisco, like we are really just like, we're a really small city in a lot of ways. And the wine industry is really compact, but everyone is incredibly supportive of one another. And I just at one of the tastings I was at today, I was talking about this with another wine director who he's really just come up the ranks at this one restaurant. And now he's the wine director there. And this guy, he's always joking. He's like, he's like, I don't have a diploma. He's like, if this doesn't work out, I'm going back to McDonald's. But the thing is like, it's such a small city that he's never going to have to worry about that because everybody here is really uplifting. And so, if you want to, I think that's a really important thing in wine because wine, a lot of it is sharing your knowledge, sharing your skills, sharing your wine. And if you're in a city where people are really like closed off and don't want to build community, it's not going to help your career grow.
I have one last question that I just meant to ask you earlier. How do you choose the wines you bring into the shop? How do you decide that?
Yeah, so we actually blind taste everything that we bring into Decant because one of the founding principles that we opened up with was we wanted to bring quality and value back to the wine industry. That when you walk into a lot of stores or even Trader Joe's, Whole Foods, whatever it is, those buyers are not focused on conveying, oh, this is what Shiraz from Australia should taste like. They're focused on how much margin can I make off this bottle. They don't care about how it was farmed or how it was made or any of that stuff. So for us, we have a couple of, we are open to tasting anything, but we have sort of rules as far as what we taste. We blind taste everything and we ask the representatives from the companies, the importers or the distributors to, we only want to know the grape, the price, it must be at minimum sustainably farmed. And we want to know the appellation because we do like to taste for typicity. Because when we first opened, the first week we opened, I remember this story very, very vividly. We had this woman come in and she was an older woman, I think, maybe in her like 60s or 70s. And she said, oh, I want to buy a red wine in this price point. And so I said, oh, what about this Chateauneuf du Pape? She said, oh, I hate Chateauneuf du Pape. I was like, oh, well, that's a really strong statement. Why do you hate it? And ultimately what she said was, she said, well, I bought a Chateauneuf du Pape once from Trader Joe's and it was terrible, and she said, basically what she ended up describing was that the wine was super, super jammy and really sweet and too alcoholic. And so we, part of the privilege of why we opened Decant to be both a shop and a bar was so that we could literally just pop a bottle. You want to have a conversation with somebody, pop a bottle and show them. And so we did that with her and she goes, oh my God, she's like, I didn't know this is what Chateauneuf du Pape was supposed to taste like. Because she had only ever bought wine from these places where, again, they're not buying to sell wine that tastes a certain way or to taste like Chateauneuf du Pape. They're buying it to how much money can we make on the bottle. And so I think part of what we are all doing in the wine industry and as the community that we're trying to foster nationwide these days is really changing the story about wine, like changing what people understand. I think all of us, kind of all sommeliers, we're pushing towards this idea of wine is a food and it should be enjoyed like a food. It shouldn't be like, oh, I'm going to a party and we're going to be slamming a bunch of wine. It should be the first question we ask people is, what are you going to eat this with? And I think it's important. So when we taste, that's why we taste, is we taste to say, is the consumer going to learn something from this bottle? And if they are going to learn something from it, then it can earn a place on our shelves.
How important are labels in that conversation though?
Labels, you mean like producers or?
No, like labels, like what the label looks like.
Also, that's why we brown bag everything. So again, blind tasting is that we're not looking at the bottles when they're being poured for us. We really just want to look at the juice in the glass and is it worth the money you're telling me it costs? And that has been really good for us because it's also, the idea of, for instance, allocations. Right? Like, there's some wines where you're not going to get a chance to taste them. And year after year, people will tell you, oh yeah, I know that producer. I've bought those wines. I know what they're going to taste like. This has happened to us on many occasions where someone has blinded us on a new vintage of a producer or a wine that we know. And, in our lineup and our notes will be like, we didn't like that wine. And then the bag gets pulled off and you're like, oh my God, I didn't wow. Like I hated that wine. And this is a wine that I have bought for 6 years in a row. So that really taught us a lesson that, especially with, in San Francisco, there's a ton of wine books, a ton of importers, a ton of salespeople. We try to taste with new people as much as we can, but it's really important to kind of remove all your bias and give people the same blank slate to work off of.
Yeah, that's great. That's really great. Does anybody else have one last question before we?
I do see. Hey, Simi, this is Monique.
Hi, Monique.
I have a question like to piggyback off of that. Did you always have that model in the beginning, or did you did you guys in there saying you were going to curate the shelves a specific way, or was that model something you had from the beginning?
The model of tasting that way?
Yeah, with blind tasting.
Yeah, that we've done since the beginning. Unless sometimes you have producers in town who are like, obviously what they're pouring because they're pouring their own wine. If we're tasting a lineup of different wines, we always do it blind. That's from the beginning. That's been a really important marker for us of how to really examine quality, because we both came from backgrounds where it was kind of a given of, you build a list based on you want this many wines from one region at these different price points, and then you forget about what's in the bottle. And so we wanted to avoid that.
Got you. Thank you.
So do you have wines that are always available, or do you constantly change out your selection?
No, we are constantly rotating through different SKUs. Like we'll buy a case of something and maybe we won't buy it again. We're very responsive to what our local, everyday customers are asking for. So, there might be periods where people in the neighborhood are really into orange wine, for instance. Like that's something that happened during the pandemic, is suddenly everybody got into orange wine. So we had to really significantly increase our shelves in that particular area because so many of our local residents were interested in it. At the end of the day, we're also, while we do have the online and we do a lot of national things, we are still a community business. And so we try to really be responsive to what the local neighborhood is looking for. But at the same time, it's, I think, much, again, trying to convey the idea of like what we all do in this industry is we're always tasting new wines. There are trends in the industry constantly ebbing and flowing. And that's reflected on our shelves. Like we might find a new producer and we stock those wines for a few months, but then maybe another producer comes in who we also want to give a shout out to. Like being a small business, we can't carry an endless amount of inventory. So we always tell our customers, like, don't get too attached to anything because it might not be here in 6 months. But yeah, it's always turning over.
I do have one question. So because you are Indian, do you find that you always make sure that there are some Indian wines available in your store?
No, actually. So there's not really a lot of Indian wine imported into the US. And to be very honest with you, the wines that I've tasted, I just don't think are like up to scuff with the quality that we're working with. But again, there's not a lot of demand. We do certainly work with some Indian owned brands. Actually, this month is Diwali, which is a huge Indian holiday at the end of the month. So every year we do we have like a little party, like a Diwali party. And we have a local Indian owned winery that she's going to be pouring her new releases, and we do a little food. And then we ship out, we have a gift pack that we ship nationwide that is Indian made, like Desi American owned products. So we have an olive oil this year, actually, like a chili oil from California, and like a chai masala mix. And then again, a bottle of wine that's owned by an Indian American winery. But we again, like we try to do as much as we can for as many people as we can. That's the platform we have. But that also means like we're constantly changing. So we always have a little bit of something throughout the year, but we can't always stock everything all the time. Yeah. I did have one thing to share. So since y'all are on this call today, we understand everyone's like learning and in different places in their wine careers. So we did want to just share that we are offering everyone on this call a discount code. That's like a nice one-time code if you want to shop with us online. We do ship to most states. There's a handful of states we cannot ship to, unfortunately, like Oklahoma and Alabama and some of those states down south. But I'm going to put the code into the chat, and you can use this code at your checkout. If you want to join one of our wine clubs, it'll give you 15% off of your first wine club shipment or whatever order you want to place online. So if you guys are interested in looking through our inventory, it's shop.decantsf.com, and the discount code will be HUE15 with a capital H. But I'll put that into the chat, and then maybe the Hue Society, if you guys signed up, we can forward it to you all, and you can email it to anyone who registered for the call.
Yeah, we'll send that out for sure across the listserv. And Simi, could you also drop your Instagram? And if people have more questions, would they be able to email you? Because I know that there are a couple people on here who definitely want to open wine shops, very interested in that. And also there, we have a chapter in San Francisco. So just being able to drop by the shop and, say hello and all those things. So if you drop that information, and people can follow you on Instagram at Decant SF, right?
Yeah, decantsf.com, and my email address is Simi, SIMI, at decantsf.com. I'm always happy to, answer questions, or if y'all need advice or any of that kind of stuff. Reach out. It might take me a little while to respond to you. These days, if my inbox is below 500 unread emails, I'm pretty happy. So just be patient. I will get back to you, especially going into the busy season now. But I'm always happy to talk to people, especially if you're, writing a business plan is really hard, but it's so important. And I'm always happy to lend whatever advice or input I can for those who would like to hear it.
Well, thank you, Ms. Nam. I hope you have an amazing rest of your day off. I'm going to give people a chance to write down the IG and your email before we jet, but thank you so much for taking some time and, chatting with the community and, sharing your journey. And we definitely will be supporting you for sure. And looking forward to us continuing to evolve together. And, I hope that you get that dating life together.
Yeah, fingers crossed. My mother would be so happy about that.
Win all of ours. But thank you. Have a great night, everybody. And we will see you at the next event. And I hope that, you guys are all safe, healthy, and thriving. Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
dear.
Thank you.
Good night.
Night.